Hi, everyone. My name is Maureen Folk, and I'm the Outreach and Program Coordinator at the Chapman Museum. This talk is titled Great Camps of the Gilded Age, the Elite Adirondack Experience. So before we dive into some of the specific camps that were built in the Adirondacks, I want to first talk about what was happening during this time in the United States and provide some background on the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age was a period in American history from approximately 1870 to 1900, and it was characterized by immense industrial growth and rampant political corruption here in the United States. It actually gets its name from a Mark Twain novel titled The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today. This was released in 1873, and it actually satirizes the greed and political corruption that was widespread in post-Civil War America. The use of the word gilded was completely intentional by Twain and meant to convey that what was shiny and gold on the surface was just a facade for something more rotten beneath. The Gilded Age was a really interesting time in American history. It was a time of rapid technological, economic, and industrial growth that turned the United States into an economic powerhouse. But this process created divides in wealth, in standing, and in opportunity. And at this time, the richest 4,000 families in the United States had the same amount of wealth as the 11 million Americans. And this is in the late 1800s. So the United States comes out of the Civil War in 1865, and there's very little in terms of a national market. Everything you needed could be found and purchased locally. But this begins to change as railroads knit the country together, and suddenly merchants, manufacturers, and industrialists can consider buying and selling on a national stage. Now, this turns the country into a series of cities that were looking to attract workers, and thus regions become more and more urbanized. By the early 1880s, the Pennsylvania Railroad carried 2 million tons of consumer goods each year. Steel from Pittsburgh was shipped nationally, coal was coming from Wyoming, copper from Montana, silver from Nevada and Colorado, and timber from Oregon. A wave of migration at this time also more than doubled the United States population and created a more diverse nation. Towns and cities were springing up overnight as they grew off the backs of these various industries. This growth was incredible, but private companies were taking over every aspect of the business, leading to unchecked wealth and the creation of monopolies. These captains of industry were most notably John D. Rockefeller in the oil industry, Andrew Carnegie in steel, and Cornelius Vanderbilt in railroads. As politics and business clashed, these industrialists funded government entities to act in their best interest. Across the US, there was a huge distrust in the government because of this. Both political parties were so clearly pro-business over anything else. While the Sherman Antitrust Act was passed in 1890, it wasn't until Teddy Roosevelt stepped into office in 1901 that monopolies truly came to an end, earning him that nickname, Trust Buster. During this time of intense economic changes, wealthy New Yorkers were looking to escape the city and head north to the woods. The Adirondack Park was nestled 200 miles north of New York City and less than 50 miles north of the Erie Canal, making it fairly accessible. They were seeking romanticized versions of the wilderness where they could live in comfort with the luxuries of home. And this is where great camps came into play. In the Adirondacks at this time, Dr. Thomas Clark Durant was a prominent railroad tycoon who was actively working to expand rail lines into the Adirondacks so that tourists could more easily access this region. His son, William West Durant, was interested in exploring his passion for architecture. Through this exploration, Durant developed the design for the first Great Camp. So a little background first. Durant was born in Brooklyn in 1850. At the age of 11, Durant crossed the Atlantic in the Great Eastern Steamship in 1861, bound for his European education. After finishing school, he traveled to Egypt, While he was in Egypt, his father called him home in 1874 to help develop the rail system in the central Adirondacks. Durant's father owned 500,000 acres in the Adirondacks at this time, and he was very eager to open it up for tourists. Durant's father tasked him with designing a retreat for entertaining investors and developers. So Durant then embarked on his very first Great Camp construction, which would become Pine Knot in 1877. So before we talk about specific camps, what is a Great Camp? The style developed as Durant constructed these camps, but they had some basic elements in common. Camps were traditionally constructed of native materials, including logs, bark, and stone, and they were also traditionally built by local population. This use of local materials and local labor at the Great Camps really embodied the values of the naturalist movement that's happening during the late 19th century. Durant's goal was to combine the best features of the early Adirondack log cabin with elements he had seen on Swiss chalets from his time spent in Europe. This created a unique style that perfectly fit into the woodland and lakeshore settings of the Adirondacks. Building materials had to be natural, and so plaster, wallpaper, or paint were nearly eliminated from use. Some instances where they are used exist. Certain tree types served better for construction than others. Spruce was best for roof boards. Pine and spruce were good for ceilings. Birch, beech, maple, and fir were used for floors and stairs. Elements like birch bark siding, decorative ironwork, bark-covered furniture, and inlaid tables or dressers were also very common for this style. Buildings that were separate were connected by covered boardwalks and passageways. Even though they were expansive, these camps often were intended to harmonize with nature. When designing them, the unpredictability of Adirondack weather also had to be considered. So structures were spread out to reduce the risk of the spread of fires, and foundation logs were raised off the ground with stone so as not to rot with the moisture in the ground. The locations chosen for camps were often so remote that lakes and rivers served as the highways to bring in materials or to travel to the camp. Teams of oxen also hauled material over mountains or frozen lakes. While the property was expansive, these camps would become known for being extremely difficult to travel to. The remote nature of these private estates also meant that families traveling north would travel by train, stagecoach, or boat, maybe stagecoach or train again, and it would take days or more than a week to arrive at some of these camps. Durant's first project, Pine Knot, was built over a 13-year period on the shores of Racket Lake starting in 1877, and it epitomized what would become known as the Adirondack rustic style. Durant began by building an enclave of cabins and was inspired to name it Pine Knot after a large, knotted pine tree on the property. Each building he constructed was meant to serve a distinct purpose instead of having one building for everything. This included a lodge, cabins for sleeping, a kitchen building, a dining building, a space for games, and a boathouse. At completion, Pine Knot was a compound of more than 10 buildings. After construction finished, Durant sold Pine Knot Camp to railroad industrialist Collis P. Huntington in 1895. A few years later, Huntington would sadly pass, and the camp remained empty for nearly 50 years until it was gifted to SUNY Cortland in 1949. It was then renamed the Huntington Memorial Outdoor Education Center and hosts school groups year-round. Having fallen in love with this architectural style, Durant set out to build another camp in 1890. Camp Uncas was nestled on the shores of Lake Mohegan. It was constructed completely of materials that were found on site and was built in just 2 years compared to the 13 that it had taken to finish Pine Knot. Durant built Uncas with the hope that it would become his private home at some point, but facing financial hardship from the money he had spent to build these camps, Durant was forced to sell Uncas to J.P. Morgan in 1896. Morgan maintained a masculine-style camp with mounted animals, bearskin rugs, and the look of a hunting lodge. J.P. Morgan died in 1913, and the camp passed to his children and their heirs. In 1947, Uncas was sold to Margaret Emerson Vanderbilt, who also owned nearby Camp Sagamore. It would be used as a Boy Scout camp for several years, but it was sold again in 1975 for private use. Despite his debt growing higher and higher from these ambitious constructions, Durant began building his most renowned project next, Great Camp Sagamore. Durant began building Sagamore in 1895, and this would be his most extensive and most expansive project to date. He had three goals in mind when building Sagamore. He wanted to prove that summer quarters could be made comfortable for winter use. He wanted to be the first to invite friends for Christmas dinner in an isolated winter setting. And the third is that he wanted to be acknowledged as the greatest host and entertainer in the Adirondacks. Obviously, he had an ego. The chimney was the first element built with local stone, and it symbolized bringing a piece of the nearby mountains into the cabin. Again, Durant was hoping that by the end of construction, Sagamore would be his home and he could live out his life and entertain his own family and friends. Unfortunately, as he continued to face financial hardship, he was forced to sell the 27 buildings at Sagamore in 1901 to Alfred G. Vanderbilt for $162,500, even though he claimed it cost him about $250,000 to construct. Alfred was the third son of Cornelius Vanderbilt, the prominent railroad baron. Alfred was an accomplished sportsman and wanted to use Sagamore as a private recreational and entertainment retreat. After purchase, Alfred immediately began to make changes by adding additional guest cottages, a wigwam, a playhouse, and a tennis court. Vanderbilt's wife, Elsie French, did not share his enthusiasm for the camp's rustic character. So between 1903 and 1908, when they divorced, Sagamore saw rare and infrequent use. However, they did add a water and sewer system, as well as a nursery for their children. In 1911, Alfred married Margaret Emerson McKim, who was a leading society hostess and sportswoman. The two shared a love of Sagamore and expanded it until Alfred tragically passed on the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915. Following his passing, Margaret continued to upgrade Sagamore over the years. She added electricity, a phone system, laundry facilities, expanded service housing, increased capacity for Sagamore to host more guests, including a dining room expansion, a roulette wheel, a pool table, and a ping pong table added to the playhouse, as well as the addition of a private bowling alley. There were numerous amenities by the time she was done, so Sagamore was really only giving the illusion of that rustic nature. Sagamore could sleep 99 guests in 46 different bedrooms. Guests could wash in one of 23 bathrooms or enjoy one of the 28 fireplaces. Margaret also knew the importance of taking care of the workers who ran the camp. She believed that they gave the camp life, and so a workers' complex was constructed where staff could comfortably live year-round. Margaret hosted family and friends for nearly 40 years at Sagamore. Some of the guests who stayed include General Pershing, Lord Mountbatten, Averell Harriman, George C. Marshall, and Gary Cooper. One of Margaret's favorite things was to play games with her visitors. They were expected to take part in outdoor activities and indoor games if the weather was poor. As her kids grew older, they were less interested, and a family dispute caused Margaret to donate the Sagamore to Syracuse University in 1954. Syracuse would use the camp until the mid-1970s, when deferred maintenance caused Syracuse to sell Sagamore to New York State. Now, this is where things get a little bit tricky. Under New York State's Forever Wild provision, This meant that Sagamore would need to be demolished so that the land could revert to the natural state. For those unfamiliar with the details of the Forever Wild provision, it was added to the New York State Constitution in 1894. Article 14, Section 1, stated that lands possessed by the state, or those purchased or given to the state hereafter that are within the designated forest preserve, being the Adirondack Park, shall not be leased, sold, or exchanged, or be taken by any corporation, nor shall timber be removed or destroyed. This was to protect as much land as possible at a time when logging was rapidly depleting the Adirondack forests. So when Sagamore was sold to New York State, this provision was set into action, which meant that in order to return to the natural state of the land, Sagamore, all of those buildings that had been constructed on the property, would need to be demolished. So the newly formed Preservation League of New York rallied to save the camp from suffering this fate. They successfully lobbied the state to preserve the camp, offering them by bid to a nonprofit that would preserve and use the camp in a compatible manner with its wilderness setting. Two preservationists, Barbara Glasser and Howard Kirschenbaum, won the bidding for Sagamore and began using this property to educate about Adirondack history, culture, and the environment. Sagamore was one of the lucky ones. Several camps were not saved by passionate bidders and were demolished in alignment with the Forever Wild provision. Today, Sagamore remains open for seasonal visitors, should you be inspired to go. By 1904, Durant was bankrupt despite the sale of these three camps. While he lacked financial responsibility, Durant is still credited with bringing attention to the Central Adirondacks, and he created a legacy that draws millions of people to the region each year. Durant had various dealings in the years that followed. He managed a hotel on Long Lake in 1910. He attempted mushroom farming in Maine with no success. And then Durant would die in 1934 at the age of 83 with little to no money, but he was not ultimately unhappy about that. Durant was not the only architecture to design and construct these great camps. His style inspired several architects such as William Coulter, Robert Robertson, his cousin Clark Durant, and William Diston. As the style developed, designers wanted the camps to be comparable in scale to the cottages in Newport or the spas of Saratoga. Because it was considered fashionable to own a camp, prominent families like the Webbs, Hookers, Whitneys, Rockefellers, Harrimans, and Siegelmans built camps under the leadership of some of these architects. As the era of great camps evolved, it went from building quiet retreats to the construction of a playground for the nation's richest. Over the 60-year period these camps were constructed, the style would evolve in many ways, as more than 100 great camps were constructed in the Adirondacks. What I'd like to do now is kind of transition to talking about what I think are just a few of the more interesting great camps that have been built and the families who financed them. North Point was purchased in 1902 by Lucy Carnegie, the widow of Andrew Carnegie's brother Thomas. Unlike Durant's classic style, North Point featured design reminiscent of the Swiss chalet and was designed by Kirtland Cutter. The chalet-style design is unique on Racket Lake, but it still fell in line with the elements that make up a great camp. The main lodge connects with the dining and kitchen wings, as well as family quarters. Despite the differences, North Point was still filled with trophies from hunting and other rustic Adirondack elements. North Point would later become a commercial vacation destination in the 1920s. The North Point Inn, and later the North Point Club, took up residence in a large complex of cottages and other buildings on the property. The assembly and dining buildings have been maintained as a private residence since the 1950s. Another camp that I'd like to mention is White Pine. White Pine is located in Paul Smith's and was built in 1907 for Archibald White. It differed from other great camps by being a bit more modern, but the exterior siding remained rustic in its look. It featured an indoor tennis court, a bowling alley, two boathouses, and an authentic Japanese tea house you could reach via boardwalk, which extended out over Osgood Pond. But the most interesting anecdote is that for one summer in 1926, White Pine Camp was home to President Coolidge and served as the summer White House for 10 weeks. Coolidge was somewhat introverted, so this was a welcome getaway. Coolidge spent most of his mornings fishing off the boardwalk, and he allegedly drove the cooks crazy because he would keep bringing them more and more fish to be cleaned and cooked for dinner. While White Pine is one of the smaller camps, it was certainly significant as it served as the interim capital of the United States that summer. Later on, White Pine would be owned by daughter of the Sears Roebuck chairman, Julius Rosenwald. It was then given to Paul Smiths and used as student housing until the 1970s. In 1993, it was purchased by White Pine Camp Associates, and it now welcomes guests each year. An electrical fire in June of 2020 did destroy nearly half of the property, but luckily this main lodge was spared. Starting a bit later in 1933, the Rockefeller family enjoyed their time away at Camp Wonundra. This camp was designed by William Diston for William A. Rockefeller, the great-nephew of John D. Rockefeller. The vision for Diston was a year-round camp overlooking Upper Saranac Lake. Diston challenged the traditional nature of these camps having separate buildings and instead designed Wonundra to have multiple wings. It was still a 9-building complex when it was completed, but more of the living and dining spaces were combined. Diston was applauded for this build, and it earned him a spot alongside Durant and Coulter in reputation. One of the only elements that separates Wonundra from most great camps is that the white pine logs had to be imported from Canada. The Adirondacks were suffering from the impact of the logging industry, especially after major fires in 1903 and 1908, and it was short on lumber for builds of this scale. So since it was of no monetary concern and this project was completed on an unlimited budget, those logs were shipped in from Canada. Wonundra was later known as the Point. Top Ridge is perhaps one of the most decadent camps in the Adirondacks. Purchased in 1920 by Marjorie Meriwether Post, who was the daughter of C.W. Post and the heiress to the Post Cereal Corporation. After her father passed in 1914, she built the company into General Foods Corporation. Located on Upper St. Regis Lake, Post wanted a spectacular camp. When it was fully operating, a staff of 85 was needed to maintain it. Built in 1923, Top Ridge took the Adirondack rustic style to new heights. The centerpiece of it all was a grand lodge with a fireplace large enough that a person could stand inside. Because the camp was uniquely positioned on a peninsula, multiple buildings were considered waterfront. Initially, the only way to access Top Ridge was by boat. When guests arrived at the boathouse, they would be escorted to board an escalator that would take them in rail cars up the hill to be welcomed at the Grand Lodge. Post wanted a full view of St. Regis Mountain, so she imported a special piece of glass that measured 10.5 feet in height. The glass was ordered from Utica and brought across St. Regis Lake by barge. It took 15 men to install the glass. It provided that spectacular view that she was hoping for. However, several years later, the Air Force was conducting a drill, and an overhead jet caused a sonic boom that shattered that 10.5-foot window. It was quite literally irreplaceable, but Post was reimbursed $3,600 by the American government for the destruction of property. The era of great camp construction would span from 1870 to 1930, when the Great Depression caused many to sell their expensive properties. Over the course of those 60 years, upwards of 120 camps would be completed by a variety of architects. The style became so popular that it was adopted in the Pacific Cascades, the Rockies, the Northern Great Lakes, in private homes, and by 1916, the National Park Service would adopt the use of the Adirondack rustic style in lodges at Yellowstone, Glacier, and Jackson Hole. Great camps were host to some of the most influential and wealthy individuals of their time. These figures took to the Adirondacks for a simpler life and found renewed peace in nature. These great camps were not without their extravagant stories, including a gondola imported from Venice, a chef from the White House, or a baseball match between Harvard and Yale under the pines. But most of the stories are that of quality time spent with family or friends, something that was always central to Durant's original vision. Today, owning and maintaining these camps comes at a steep price. Some camps have been declared significant enough to be designated as National Historic Landmarks, which has been important for protecting these properties. But these camps did more than just bring the wealthy to the Adirondacks. This time period and interest in the region spurred the increase in tourism from around the world, and that led to improvements in stagecoach service, expansions of inns and guest houses. The access that we have to the Central Adirondacks today would not have been the same had it not been for the Great Camp era. Many admired the Great Camps, such as Seneca Ray Stoddard, and he wrote a passage in his 1888 guidebook that I'd like to end on. These camps are never really completed, for one of the fascinating features of the camp is that it is bound by no rules of time and architecture. It expands and blossoms with the passing seasons.